Hi everyone, it's Intang Mayumi. For today's video, I made 3 cards using Fawn Caramel Apple stamp set, and I also used the coordinating dies. I pull out my scraps of Strathmore 90-pound watercolor paper, and I'm going to ink up my caramel apple image using VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I will stamp a few of them and I will emboss them with clear embossing powder. I love this stamp set. It is so adorable. It has faces that you can add to the caramel apple image. After I add the clear embossing powder, I will melt it using my heat tool. I use my Magello Mission Gold to color the images. I will also add some shimmer to the caramel on the apple using Jello Roll Stardust Clear Pen. I also use light gray Sig marker for the stick of the caramel apple. I will leave some music here and I will be back when the coloring is done. Now that the image are colored, I will die cut them using the coordinating die. I'm glad I also got the coordinating dies for this stamp set because the die saves me a lot of time. So here are my caramel apple ready to go. I'm going to use one of the paper from Lanfon Perfectly Plaid Fall 6x6 paper pad. And I'm going to use the largest die from the die set. I secure the die with washi tape so it doesn't move when I run it through my cuddle bag. I die cut another one with 110-pound white cardstock and adhere them together so it's going to be sturdy. I use double-sided tape to adhere the frames on top of each other. And for the inner piece, I just use my ATG gun to adhere the pattern paper on top of the white cardstock. I again use double-sided tape at the back of the frame so I can adhere my acetate. And just cut the excess acetate along the edges of the frame. So this is the step I always forget, is to adhere the inner piece of the die cut on the card base first and use the frame to inlay so it will be perfectly aligned. But because I already adhere my acetate on the frame, I can't use it. So I die cut another one from white cardstock and use that to inlay the inner part of my die cut piece. I did save the frame die cut so I can reuse it again later because I know I'm going to forget that again when I do a shaker card project. After that's done, I used foam tape on the back of the frame. I cut strips of foam tape so it will fit on the edges of the frame. I then run my powder tool on the edges of the foam tape so when I put my shaker pieces inside, they are not going to stick on the foam tape. And now it's time to add the shaker pieces inside. I used 3 of the green caramel apples and also 3 of the red caramel apples. And I also use this, I don't know what you call them, but they're not sequins, but I have them in my stash, so I thought this is perfect to go with the caramel apples. And now it's time to remove all the foam tape backing and adhere the frame on top of the card base. And our shaker card is working. I pull out my scraps of ivory cardstock and I will stamp my sentiment on the paper using Memento rhubarb stock ink. I'm using my Stamp Perfect here to align the sentiment and also help me to stamp it a couple of times to get good impression. And now I'm going to use this die again to die cut my sentiment so it will perfectly fit in the inside of the frame. I had to cut a little bit on the top of my sentiment, so I just quickly use my Fiskars trimmer to cut that. I also use Barn Door Distress ink to add a little bit of color on the edges of the sentiment. And just add double-sided tape on the back of the sentiment and adhere it on the card. For the inside of the card, I use green and red caramel apple and adhere them using liquid glue. And our first card is finished. For the second card, I used the Mama Elephant Fame Frames die set, and I'm also going to use one of the pattern paper from the Fawn Perfectly Plaid Fall 6x6 paper pad. I die cut the pattern paper using the scallop die from the Mama Elephant Frames die set. I'm also going to die cut watercolor paper using the stitch rectangle from the set. I use quinacridone gold watercolor to just add color on the paper, so I have a background for my images later. And then dry the paper using my heat tool. I also use Glimmer Mist to add a little bit of shimmer on my panel and just spray all over the panel. And again, dry the paper with my heat tool. I added some foam tape on the back of my images, but before I adhere them, I'm going to stamp my sentiment first on my panel and use the images to know where the exact place to put my sentiment. And I'm using my Stamp Perfect again so I can stamp the sentiment a couple of times to get good impression. And I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink to ink up my sentiment. And now I'm ready to adhere my green and red caramel apples. We can now adhere the scallop panel using ATG gun. I use strong double-sided tape and a little bit of liquid glue because this watercolor panel is a little bit warped and I want to make sure it is adhered well. For the inside of the card, I die cut another panel from white cardstock using the Mama Elephant frames die and adhere one of the caramel apple on the lower part of the panel. Add some ATG tape at the back of the panel and adhere it on the inside of the card. And our second card is finished. For the third card, I'm using this dark blue shimmer cardstock from my stash. I will use 2 colors from this Kiritake Pearl Colors and 2 colors from Prima Metallic Accents. I will stamp the caramel apple image onto the cardstock or panel, but before I do that, I run my powder tool to remove a static on the panel. And then I'm using Versamark ink to stamp the caramel apple image and stamp the image all over the panel. After the stamping is done, I will pour some white embossing powder on the panel, and I'm using coffee filter to catch the excess powder. And then I will melt all that powder using my heat tool. I added drops of water on the watercolors to activate them and just mix it good before I apply the color to the images. I will leave some music here again, and I will be back when the coloring is done. So here is my colored panel. I will use one of the largest die from Gina Marie Designs Wonky Stitches 4 layers and die cut my panel. And when I removed the die from the panel, I noticed that the embossing on the panel crack where the stitches are. So I don't like the looks of it, but I leave it like it is because I don't want to color another panel. I also used the second to the largest die from the set and die cut a vellum that will go on top of the panel and stitch them together using my sewing machine and just remove the excess thread. For the sentiment, I'm using scraps of craft cardstock and stamp the sentiment using VersaFine Onyx Black ink and emboss it with clear embossing powder. And melt all the powder using my heat tool. And then just trim the sentiment using my Fiskars trimmer. I went ahead and put some double-sided tape on the back of the panel, and I will adhere it on top of a 110-pound craft card base. I also added some foam tape on the back of the images and sentiment and adhere them on top of the vellum. For the inside of the card, I die cut another panel using Gina Marie Designs 4 layers die set. Adhere the panel in the inside of the card and add 2 of the caramel apple images. And lastly, I decided to add the smiley faces on the caramel apples, and I think that's much better and it looks cute. Here are my finished cards for you today using the Fawn Caramel Apple Stamp Set and coordinating dies. As always, thank you so much for always watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate it. I hope you like today's cards, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.